Welcome to Season 7, Episode 8 of Solarpunk Presents. Today I'll be talking to Dr. Gabe Filippelli about the Trump administration's attack on democracy and public health via its attack on science and universities. Welcome to the episode. I'm very excited to be talking to Dr. Gabe Filippelli. Today, Gabe is a Chancellor's Professor of Earth Sciences at the Indiana University Indianapolis and Executive Director of the Indiana University Environmental Resilience Institute, whose mission is to co-create environmental resilience and climate solutions by integrating research, education, and community. As a fellow biogeochemist, I know Gabe is someone who researches the connections between geochemistry and the geologic record of climate change. But he also works at that interface where geochemistry intersects with human health. So, not just in terms of the effects of climate change, but also on helping people and communities deal with toxic elements like lead or the fine particulate byproducts of fossil fuel combustion. But back in the day, Gabe was a teaching assistant in the marine geology course I took when I was an undergraduate at UC Santa Cruz. This was more or less my first foray into the world of geology and the beginning of my journey from marine biologist to oceanographer to biogeochemist. So thank you, Gabe. You clearly had a lasting positive impression. I should also mention that on top of all the other things he has accomplished, Gabe has published a couple of books. And you should check out Climate Change and Life, the complex co-evolution of climate and life on Earth and beyond. That's from Elsevier Press. I'll put the link in the show description. And now, my talk with Gabe. Hello and welcome, Gabe. Let's talk the Trump administration's assault on democracy via the assault on science and higher education. What is happening right now?
Everything from all directions all at once are happening right now. And not much of it is positive from, at least from my perspective as an individual scientist, but also as somebody who is a bit of a science leader in various avenues in the US. What I see a lot is they're trying to enact a lot of government efficiency protocols, which are very ham-handed in their application. They're trying to incorporate their assault on DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, via assault on science that focuses on some of that work. And they're trying to diminish the US's role of science abroad, particularly through the USAID and the State Department, US State Department. Pretty much in every direction I look, it's chaos, and it's significantly impacting a lot of sectors, including universities.
Some of your projects were first on the chopping block.
Indeed, I think mine was one of the very first that I knew of, at least. Now there's thousands of others that have been terminated. I had a project that I had been working on for about a year that is part of my position as an air quality advisor for the US Embassy in Pakistan, which has notoriously bad air and very few ways to not only do anything about it, but even to measure it, even to get the science on the ground to measure. And one of the only ways that is available to Pakistanis for air quality monitoring is actually the air quality monitors that were developed and built into a lot of the embassy sites throughout the world, including 4 in Pakistan. So the project that I had been working on with Pakistani universities is to help strengthen their capacity to work on air quality and climate change issues, and to kind of provide some of the lessons learned from the US for them, as well as to have an exchange program. That was terminated in March, with the only explanation being that it didn't no longer accorded with the US State Department priorities. And the particularly frustrating aspect of that termination is that we've been working a very long time to develop the proposal. It got the full vetting of the State Department, as you can imagine. It started in October of last year. We'd spent almost nothing on it because all of it was just the planning part. It wasn't any implementation. And then 6 months later, terminated without any explanation, and leaving our Pakistani colleagues and partners in a lurch.
So you must have been employing people over there to do some of the work?
Indeed, employing them, we were had a large acquisition of air quality monitors to be used in a kind of a community science sort of way, so spread out throughout communities that the universities would then leverage for educational purposes, outreach purposes. We had a couple NGO partners who were on board and already gearing up, actually spending real time in preparation. Just nothing had been billed yet. So this is a grant. It wasn't a large grant by, by standards that I'm usually familiar with. There's like $300,000, of which a lot of it was to go to Pakistan. And we spent, I think, $4,000 of it. That's how much we were able to bill before it was terminated.
Kind of unprecedented, them just canceling a grant that you've signed contracts for.
Yeah, legally
Uh,
signed.
so do you have to give all the money back or just what you haven't spent at that point?
All except the $4,000 that we spent. The idea, the federal grants are done in such a way that they back pay for, so university fronts the costs, and this is really standard with contracts and grants. And then we bill either quarterly or semi-annually, and then they send us the check, as it were. It's all virtual, of course, nowadays. And in this case, we just hadn't been able to bill yet because we weren't starting until the second half of the year in earnest on spending money. So there it goes. But this is just but one example of many other examples where programs have either been newly awarded or had been in their second phase of renewal, so 8 years in, and just simply terminated, meaning that it leaves a lot of graduate students, a lot of other science support staff without employment.
Completely devastating. And from one day to the next, a time in life when you don't have a lot of savings and you've just moved maybe for a job. And, I can imagine it's a complete disaster. I want to talk about that a little bit more later. I'm really, really curious as to was someone going through all of the grants and just going, okay, this one, this one, this one, this one? They're doing keyword searches. I mean, how are they? I mean, never mind why they chose the grants that they did, but I mean, there must be tens of thousands of grants running in the US at any given time.
It was a kludgy Doge Department of Government Efficiency attempt of using basically Google search to go through awards, particularly titles and summaries, and to flag those that included their list of 100 offensive words, right? And the offensive words includes things like climate change, for example. So that was, I think, what initially triggered my grant being flagged, and it was suspended first. And then the embassy was reviewing it and working with us to change the language so it would be acceptable. But then the State Department basically decided, I think, to terminate almost all of their international grants. So in the second round, when it was actually terminated, it was part of a very broad termination rather than one that's really surgically targeted toward things like climate or diversity and so forth. One of my colleagues here in Indianapolis was part of a very large Forest Service grant through the Arbor Day Foundation that you might be familiar with. They do really great work in supporting biodiversity and so forth in the US. That award was for biodiversity. Diversity got flagged and it was terminated without any possible recourse. So it was just simply terminated. And that was an easy one to terminate because money actually hadn't been spent on it yet. So there are some things I think that are easier for them to terminate. Other things which are more challenging. We have a grant from the U.S. Forest Service at my institute. It's about a $5 million grant, so it's much bigger. It's all about planting, increasing green density in underserved and overly hot communities within the state of Indiana. That has already been going on about a year and a half, and there's so many contracts already written that has not yet been touched. Similarly, with a large EPA community solar grant, a number of contracts that were written on that thing already and approved. I think in some cases, the federal agencies say we can't unspool all of this without causing significant harm.
All of this is being done in the name of saving money, or do you think there's something else going on here?
Three things. Saving money is what they start off with. That's their lead in of this Trojan horse of disaster. So saving money. Hey, we'll save money. But it's actually likely not saving anybody much in the way of money compared to the net expenditures the US government has. The second is, as I mentioned earlier, trying to use DEI as a way to say that these grants and programs at universities and other places are not in compliance with the president's executive order against having DEI in government, in anywhere in the government. And the third thing is an active attack on universities and attack on higher education systems I think, as part of the liberal deep state conspiracy that they've concocted that we all formulate in universities. The reality is that university graduates tend to be more liberal than the general population is. And so that is viewed as a threat.
So I live in Germany, and I often meet people, well, not so much anymore, but you meet a lot of people who remember the US soldiers after World War II, and they would be handing out chocolate and being nice to kids and stuff like that. And everyone's like, oh, thank God you guys came and not the Russians. People remember, say, for example, Americans coming in and doing nice things in their community that, they didn't have to do. And this is a soft power that lasts for decades. Okay, so maybe the government saved $300,000 by canceling your grant to do this work in Pakistan. And yet, never mind the public health benefits, the people of Pakistan for that, and the educational benefits and the transfer of knowledge and the increase in the economy there. But the loss of soft power just to save a piddle of money is just so ridiculous. And you wonder how they cannot understand these things.
We really, and you brought up an outstanding point. We really underappreciate the value of, you say soft power, you can also think of it as soft diplomacy, right? And I saw the exact same thing as a Peace Corps volunteer in a small island nation in the middle of the Pacific that was taken over by the Japanese during World War II, and then was liberated by Americans, by the Marines. Generations later, there are stories of the GIs providing support, assistance, and they were just so thrilled that even now, so Japan was, when it was more prosperous about 30, 40 years ago, was engaging in more transactional diplomacy to reinvigorate their tarnished reputation after World War II. And one of that is give money to build things that people need. So they built causeways in the country, for example, that connected different islands. The local people still didn't like them.
The Japanese had a reputation of being extremely ruthless in during World War II, so
Indeed. And we weren't actively supporting the Pacific Island nations a whole lot by the time I was a Peace Corps volunteer there, beyond things like Peace Corps service. But they remember it, and they remember, the U.S. friendship much more clearly. And this is a huge blunder, I think, from the U.S. And I can view this as my lens. I was a science advisor in the State Department from 2013 to 2014. I was working a lot on climate change policy. But it really gave me a really sharp insight into the power that the soft diplomacy has to develop these lasting relationships, and it's usually pretty cheap, as opposed to the more expensive transactional diplomacy that China has now banned for the last 2 decades, particularly last decade, actively engaged in, right? Here, I'll build you a mining facility, Namibia, for uranium, and I'll give you 10% of our mining profit. But in fact, every single person, working in the mine comes from China. They extract the other 90% and leave an environmental disaster, in its wake. So this transactional diplomacy that's part of their Belt and Road Initiative touches Pakistan all the time. And so this was an opportunity to say, hey, the US is still here. The US is still here and trying to make your life better. We're not going to build you a dirty coal burning power plant like the Chinese did, because that's not what we're about anymore. But we've lost that upper hand.
That also helps us fix some of our reputational damage with, when they were taking DNA samples from people as part of the vaccination program where they were looking for Osama bin Laden. I mean, that people were pretty angry about that.
Yeah.
And I suspect most people in America don't actually know that we engage in a lot of this kind of soft power, soft diplomacy kind of work. I think most Americans don't realize our government can be that subtle.
Yeah, yeah, that's very true. And to be clear, the price tag is pretty steep to do that. I mean, the budget for the State Department includes a budget for USAID. USAID technically is underneath the State Department budgetarily, not really programmatically. But that budget is pretty large. But it's not half of the US budget, which is our military, right?
Yeah.
So we still do all our normal shenanigans with, tanks and missiles and all of that. If anything, I would like to see that rebalancing significantly geared toward these kind of things we've been talking about that the State Department and USAID have been doing for so long, saving children's lives. But now I think that if you go to rural America and you go to an old coal town in Kentucky, for example, they say, why the hell are we spending money to help provide, education for women in Kenya when we have a meth epidemic right here in our town, right? We don't have any jobs. So I think that's what we're seeing. It's interesting. I don't think that this administration is necessarily now bringing jobs back to rural Kentucky yet. Nor are they going to be successfully able to reignite the coal industry, which is it's dying, if not dead.
I tend to think of you as more of a paleo climate geochemist kind of person, but you do a lot of public health work, a little bit related, well, more than a little bit related to climate change. And you also do public health work in the US. So not just in Pakistan.
No, that's right. I was reflecting on this a little bit recently because I had to write up something for our collective alma mater, the Slugs, University of California, Santa Cruz. And and it is a relatively strange journey to go from somebody who studied deep time dynamics to, working on, like you said, a little bit on climate and health, but mostly actually on environmental contamination in human health, particularly around lead poisoning, the kind of the lingering legacy of lead poisoning. And I think what inspired that was the same thing that inspired Peace Corps service, same thing that's inspired my interest to work in Pakistan is there are underserved communities here in the US who are grappling with the easiest thing to deal with in the world. Get lead out of the environment and you're going to automatically improve community health, right? But there's so few resources. And my students got so fired up by this kind of topic about 20 years ago that it fired me up. And so a lot of my effort on the health aspect is still using my roots and your roots in geochemistry, right? We still know that how elements work and how cycling works, right? Because that's what we were trained in. But if you know that, then you also know how that might intersect with the human sphere, so human health, and you know how to, at least to some extent, how to stop that really negative change from environmental contamination to poison children. And so that's been a real inspiration for me the last 20 years. And a lot of my effort has been focused in that area. A similar thing. There's people, communities that don't have resources that are left with a lot of questions. Even when the public health agencies come in and say, oh, you should, here are your risks of lead exposure. They have a simple question. First, do I have lead in my home environment? Second, if I do, what can I do about it? Because, I'm worrying about feeding my kids tomorrow. So this is where I've been increasingly stepping into this kind of gap.
Most people would have no idea how to get their homes tested for lead. And yeah, no, as scientists, we know this kind of stuff. So, and we have links to laboratories and we have equipment and we know how to write grants to get money to pay for things as
Although
well.
that is
So,
very true. Yeah.
and in fact, it was the geochemist who made the connection with lead in the first place in human health, right? Very
It,
famously.
it was Claire Patterson who not only determined with shocking accuracy the age of the Earth back in the 50s, 4.55 billion years. I think he was, maybe now where we have about a 1% difference of that origination age. But he also recognized in doing his own lab work that he couldn't get a single sample in his clean lab that was truly clean of lead. And he just spent then the rest of his career tracking down, where is this lead coming from? And he found out it was from gasoline, leaded gasoline. And he led the charge to fight against the petrochemical companies who were using lead as an anti-knock additive and claiming that there was no other option. It would make cars horrifically expensive to not run on leaded gasoline. But guess what? That was all a lie, like many of the other lies, and they did just fine.
Yeah, that's crazy. The playbook doesn't change, does it? Right. And so, yeah, Claire Patterson, I mean, no wonder he couldn't measure anything free of lead contamination. His lab was in Pasadena, right at Caltech, right up against the mountains in the LA basin, very close to downtown LA. And if he's doing that, yeah, in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, oh, the pollution from leaded gasoline, oh, it would have been a nightmare.
Indeed, yeah. And not only, yeah, that as well as, I mean, for Los Angelenos, also simply the smog, right? The combustion byproducts in that kind of environment where you had, this one of the car capitals of the world, right? At least this paradigm, and I think it's actually kind of true, where you have these wonderful coastal breezes and all of this cars driving around combusting without catalytic converters or anything. I'm combusting all these volatile organic carbon compounds and lead out of the tailpipe. And all that wind, all it acts is to push it up against the San Gabriel Mountains, where then all of the pollution just sits in that basin. And in fact, I use that story a lot, Christina, because when I chat with folks in Pakistan, for example, one of their big concerns is that they have no emission control on their vehicles whatsoever, and they use really low quality, high sulfur fuel, which causes a lot of the very fine particulates that people call particulate matter, that's 2.5 microns in size, PM 2.5. Regardless, it's danger for human health, really dangerous for human health. They calculate it takes about 3 years off the life of every single Pakistani. So, this was exactly the kind of project that I got my grant terminated for. But the point is that California decided that, this smog in Los Angeles is intolerable. My wife grew up in LA, so you remember smog days pretty frequently where there's no school because too much smog. As a consequence, there was a few studies to understand what are the source of this smog. Well, they figured out didn't take rocket science to do that. But then they pressured the automobile industry to said, hey, California now set a new standard. I don't care what the EPA standard is. Back then, there wasn't an EPA, but I don't care what the EPA standard was. We have these air quality standards. We need to clean up air in Los Angeles. And we won't allow any car to be registered in this city and in the state that doesn't pass emission criteria, which meant that almost every car being produced out of Detroit was not going to pass that. That was one of these states can have a tremendous influence if they're a big state like California, a populous state. GM and Ford, they couldn't make one car for California and then one car for the other, one model for the other 49 states. So they complied. And so hence we have, very clean vehicles now in general. So this is a story I tell in Pakistan just to say it's possible, but it does need policy. You can't expect businesses to like, hey, we want to be really nice today. We're going to reduce our profit margin by 10% to make your life easier, unless that's part of their business strategy, right? Otherwise, this is where regulation, health, and environment informs good regulation. It's never perfect, but it can be incremental, which then informs how the government invests in businesses and how businesses run, which then cycles back to improving community health. So it's a big loop. It's not hard to conceive that it's a big loop, and it really is designed to ultimately improve community health in the context of what we were just talking about.
Well, gosh, no wonder the Trump administration is attacking science and scientists because if you don't measure anything, you don't know what's going on, and you don't have standards, then companies don't have to invest money in this kind of stuff.
And our global partners, for example, don't have to be worried because another thing that they did when about 2 months ago is they turned off the functionality that was present in every U.S. embassy abroad, the functionality to see right on the cover page air quality for that day, using the high-tech air quality monitors that they'd already built and installed. Now, none of that exists in the State Department anymore. If you go look for airnow.gov, which is the main air quality system, and you look for embassy list of embassies, they're gone, disappeared.
Yeah, that has nothing to do with efficiency. Getting
No,
rid of
and the
something you
monitors are
already
still
have.
working, right? They're
Yeah.
still producing data. Fortunately, there's a back end to that, so it is being you can get to it. It's just it's not very obvious for someone who's applying if you're in Pakistan applying for a visa and also thinking, well, God, I need to work on improving the air in my own country as well.
Let's go back to the point you brought up earlier about how terrible this sudden termination of research grants is for people in early stages of their career, so PhD students and postdocs and even early career faculty and technicians and then yeah, and then people you're employing in other regards.
I'm pretty active in providing information to my legislators, which I hope everyone does. They can take it or leave it. But one of the points I bring up a lot, I have been bringing up a lot in the last 3 months, particularly. And fortunately, our senator gets it. He's a Republican, and I think in many other ways, one of our two senators, one of them clearly doesn't. But universities don't just produce knowledge, which, I think that there's concern that we produce knowledge that's liberal or woke or whatever. We could set that aside for the moment. But they also produce innovation that the US is dependent on now for decades. So, how do they produce that innovation? Well, great ideas supported by federal grants, which then hire a whole research infrastructure and train a phenomenal cadre of students. Many of them now in STEM fields, international students who, guess what? They stay in the US and they become American and they contribute to the research engine and the prosperity and security of the country. So Todd Young, who's one of our senators, wrote a very nice piece. I think it was in the Post or the Times that explained how universities are they're incubators of knowledge, they're incubators of technology, and they improve national security. They also provide a ton of jobs in the states that these people are representing, right? Threatening that is doing two things within universities. Right? There's both the real, not the threat, the real harm of terminated grants, like the one I discussed earlier, but there's existential or potential harm that comes from denying student visas, the whole disruption of a lot of our STEM workforce. With this idea that somehow we'll automatically fill all of these STEM positions at universities in terms of graduate students and postdocs with homegrown Americans. Cut this short, they don't exist. There are not nearly as many homegrown Americans who are qualified to do those things as there are international students. That's why we bring in international students, right? When you start whittling away at the confidence of young researchers or international students, the confidence that a grant that is awarded to a PI can now recruit a student from China or Poland or wherever to work and maybe even stay in the US. Now that security no longer exists. I don't have that security anymore. I have a number of grants that, students ask, well, how is it guaranteed? And I said, it's as guaranteed as anything. It used to be absolutely guaranteed. Up until 4 months ago, if you had a federal grant, the only way it's going to be terminated 99.9% of the times if there's malfeasance on the part of the PI. If I had done something bad or whatever, yeah, we violated breach of contract, terminate. That's the only way that things have been terminated in the past. And I've spoken to a lot of NSF program managers because I still review for them a lot. And they say, well, the reality is that the administration does get to decide, at least to some extent, what happens in the federal agencies because they're, under the executive branch. But the only sensible way that this has ever been enacted is for them to enact policies moving forward, not enact policies looking back. And that's what they're doing. And they actually have not gone on the record, but they have said every single grant you get terminated, appeal. Probably going to fail, but appeal anyway. Get the your universities and their lawyers to appeal the decision and see what happens. Trump administration loves to, and it always has, to inspire a lot of lawsuits. So they throw wild things at the populace and then hope that the courts will allow a part of them to stay. And so that's the idea. Is like, let's just go ahead and see what the judges say about terminated contracts without reasonable cause.
Yeah, I mean, not everyone has the resources to sue, right? So
Nope.
lawyers are expensive. And yeah, they're clearly just trying to destroy everything, and they obviously don't care about laws and rules and what you're allowed to do and what's right and what's wrong. One thing that was not on my bingo card, speaking of resistance, was Harvard University, which is such an establishment institution, leading the resistance to this attack on democracy via the attack on science and education. But on the other hand, they have very deep pockets, so they can withstand a lot more attack than a lot of other universities.
They can, and I do appreciate them standing up to this because they have two things. Not only do they have huge endowments, which is the deep pockets that you referred to, even though a lot of their operation depends on federal grants, like every other university, right? But they also they don't have to listen to state legislators because they're private. They just have a board of trustees, which is not related to the state that they're in necessarily, although I'm sure a lot of members are from the state, as opposed to a university like Indiana University, where I'm from, where our state house is maybe even more MAGA than MAGA itself. They've adopted this hyper MAGA personality because our state house also does not reflect our state. Our state house is membership is dominantly because of numbers, rural representatives, small population. So if you look at the state of Indiana, if we voted by population, we would vote Democrat every single time. Our state house would be Democrat, but that's not how we vote. But nevertheless, what's happened is that we have at Indiana University, even we've had our own academic freedoms curtailed by our state house, including the new governor who inserted in our budget bill last minute three clauses which are really deleterious, I think, to universities. One of which is that we had three of our members, our board of trustee members, voted by IU alumni. They stripped those three and said all board members, all trustees are now voted by the governor, appointed by the governor. And then last week, he quickly then fired those three alumni ones and brought in sycophants, as it were. So that was one thing that was snuck into the bill last minute. And I'm not saying Indiana is different than a lot of other states do exactly this kind of stuff. The other is that they put this arbitrary numbers to control what size programs are allowed to have at universities. If they graduate less than 15 students majors a year, then they should be terminated, without an understanding that it's not just about numbers, quantity, it's about quality. We in our Bloomington campus, we have a major in violin that probably graduates about 3 students a year. They happen to be arguably the 3 best violinists in the country. It's just a high quality Joshua Bell, a famous, he was a graduate. I mean, so that's an attack that we're actively dealing with now. Every single department of every public university in Indiana is now fighting for our lives to keep our programs going because they're deemed low enrollment. And then the final bit has to do with academic freedoms. They basically all but strip tenure in the way we think of tenure from public universities. I mean, I think it'll effectively still work the same way it always has, but nevertheless, at least on paper, they stripped it. So,
What's their end game?
yeah, their end game is to, I think, eliminate wokeism from public universities. And they see Indiana University as one of the threats. Our compatriot university is also public, called Purdue University. They've always been more kind of tech STEM focused and not nearly the number of liberal scholars that we have in Indiana University. So I think that's part of the end game is like let's eliminate wokeism. Let's turn universities into training grounds for professions rather than as incubators of thought and more informed voters.
What do they even think wokeism is?
I guess being able to view that one example is not everyone's starting line is the same. So sometimes you need to probably direct some resources to those who are starting behind or have more obstacles, so they also can have the same benefit of shining like the rest of us who start on the 50-yard line already in the beginning of let's use a football analogy.
Yeah, it's just crazy. They just seem like the Grinch here. I mean, shutting down a program that produces the best violinists in the country because it doesn't churn out enough of them
Yeah,
is
yeah,
weird. I
it's
mean, it's
weird.
trying to run a university like a make a business that makes money for shareholders. Is
Yeah.
that what they're trying to do?
No, I think that's exactly what they're trying to do. The tangible thing you can count are numbers of graduates. The intangible thing you can't count is knowledge and improving society, right? Those are the intangibles. That's the soft power of universities that they've been doing that for centuries. That's the part that's threatening, I think. There's ways around that, obviously, that we have phenomenal community and sometimes technical colleges around the country. If they just put resources there, guess what? We would finally have enough electricians. The US, oddly, is facing a monstrous electrician shortage right now because of the conversion of a lot of their crappy gas and fossil fuel relays to solar and to, all this stuff. You're not going to fill that gap by reforming universities as now, the producers of electricians. I don't think IU will ever be the world's leading producer of electricians. It's a trade that requires technical skill. And there's institutions that already do exactly that. So put money there. Don't put us under the microscope. That's my thought.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like two different things. So you have these institutes of higher education where it is, yeah, about thinking and research. And then there are also trade schools, which, yeah, have been underfunded. This is very true. And that is terrible. But they haven't been interested in fixing that problem.
Nope.
It's all a
No,
bit
they have not.
disingenuine.
Yeah. It is. And I know, I'm painting it all with a very broad brush. States function differently. Some states, likely have better investments than others. I know throughout the Midwest, this electrician shortage issue is come up in a lot of our conversations around a group that we're part of, the Midwest Climate Collaborative. And so we talk a lot to universities, but also to a lot of NGOs, a lot of organizations that are trying to do transition from fossil fuel to cleaner energy sources. And this is coming up a lot. And we're recognizing, I think, increasingly that, well, universities, the traditional, comprehensive universities, probably not the best way to fill this need, and other similar kind of needs. It's through other mechanisms, but you're right. I mean, they're hitting us over the head for things that we don't actually have ever done very well.
So why should people care about what happens to scientific education and research, and not to mention to scientists in the US? Because I don't really see the general public being like, oh, this is terrible, right? I
No,
don't see them being up in arms about this.
no. It seems, in fact, it's mostly just the scientists who are up in arms, and we've not been able to instill that same sense of alarm in the general populace. Where I see people making the disconnect is it's largely driven by, I think, partisan ideologies, and people who've been to universities and completed degrees understand the value of that university degree. It actually has tangible economic value for the graduate. Yeah, it costs money. You tend to be able to easily recoup that investment in education within the first 5 years of graduating, and then it's gravy after that, right? Your lifetime earnings are significantly higher than a non-college graduate. I mean, that is its own little problem, right? In the old days, the plumbers and electricians, the people who are highly valued, they had salaries on par with a lot of these other, white collar jobs. They don't anymore. So that's an issue that I'm not qualified to solve. But where I see that the whole world should be a little bit concerned is that the US has been a leader, for better or worse, in science and technology. And we've trained, generations of experts on this stuff. If you look through the Nobel Prize, all the major prizes, they're predominantly American scientists, not exclusively. Obviously, you're in the EU, which produces amazing science, but we're just bigger. We've been doing this for longer, and that's just the reality. It's just a numbers thing. As we're seeing, I think Americans turning away from this idea that that's a value, because they are really actively turning away from the idea that, oh, that's a good thing. We're seeing, I'm not going to be jingoistic against China, but we're seeing China just step firmly into that role. They've now exceeded the US in terms of publication output, in terms of grant, federal investment in science, in terms of everything. I've been to China a lot, and you go to the universities there, and I struggle to get one high-tech instrument, on a competitive grant that takes me maybe several grant cycles to get, like a mass spectrometer, for example. I go to these places, and there are literally three mass specs in the hallways, still in crates, because they just haven't had time to uncrate them yet. That's the level of investment that used to be present in the U.S. to some extent. It was never. I don't think I know any, and nor would you. You probably don't recall any of the halls in Santa Cruz or Santa Barbara with three unopened mass specs. But nevertheless, as China occupies that space, that has its own concerns. and the concerns we're grappling with even here in the US is that China operates under different rules. They're very top-down, federally funded systems. They have different interpretations of what technology secrets are than we do. We've had a lot of leakage. We've kind of given the jump start to a lot of Chinese industries. Not saying it's all, they do a ton of stuff on their own. I use this as a class example. One of our big concerns here in the US with our transition to renewable energies is the fact that data farms, large data farms that are doing a ton of AI simulations, just consume so much power and so much water, depending on their design, but the power is regardless of the design. And it's because they were programmed to conceive of every possible outcome. And so they have these processors, running 10,000 calculations, a quarter second to make sure they've got every simulation. The Chinese built AI engines that said, you know what, you can exclude 5% of those. We can get by with having a much more sleek, cleaner thing. And as a consequence, their AI system that they launched, or at least they proposed in the spring, a tenth of the power need, a hundredth of the microprocessor need. Yeah, and again, that was because the U.S. made AI based on trying to develop a technology for every possible outcome, and then we put that on the world. And more strategic operators are saying, well, that's great, thanks, America. Now I'm going to take that model that you did and I'm going to just make it so it works pretty well, and that's going to be good enough.
Yeah, no, but it's how things evolve, right? It's how technology evolves and becomes more efficient, more energy efficient, and well, and with AI, then more dangerous as well in
Yeah.
terms of being useful for surveillance and tracking of people and all the other things that go along with that. If there's anybody out there who's like, well, this is terrible what's happening with science and scientists, what do you think people could do to support science and scientists' education and in the same time, democracy?
Well, one thing is don't leave us on an island, please. Every citizen has the same power to contact their lawmakers at any time and voice support or lack of support. I mean, people have the ability to do what they want, but voice support for what they feel passionate about, right? I mean, they have the same voice, like their vote and their voice to their congressman has the same power as mine, even though, I'm a scientist. But I think what people should be aware of is that we are literally going backwards in terms of science. And we cannot depend on companies and industry to have our best interests at heart, because they don't. I'm not saying they're all evil, but they have shareholders, so they need to make money. Universities and scientists need to make knowledge. So you do different things. It's harder to count knowledge. It's easier to count money. So I would just again urge people to be aware that we are eroding our ability to not just to do climate change science. And yeah, maybe half the country doesn't care what climate, or disputes that it's even a real concern. We are also eroding the capability of using our understanding of climate and climate dynamics to protect them in a hurricane or in a tornado, because those are parts of the whole system that are being eroded. So tornadoes and hurricanes, they don't care if you're Republican or Democrat, they don't care how they vote, they're equal opportunity destroyers, right? So, and this disconnect just came up to me in a story I heard a couple of months ago, which is that a guy was talking about the phone, and he said, "Well, I don't. Why do I need the National Weather Service? My phone has the weather and weather warnings on it." Like, that lack of understanding that that's all coming from the National Weather Service is exactly what threatens our democracy. It's a deep naivete about the role that science plays in making our lives better. That's what I wish people would do. Is okay. Science isn't going to solve everything, but science does make your life better.
I guess as scientists, we haven't really been that vocal about the kind of work we do and why it matters. In fact, we've often frowned upon people who go out there and try to publicize science.
That's
And
true. And it's a shame. And I can point to in the climate change world a handful of amazing ambassadors and climate communicators who've committed to not only just still doing science, but communicating about it. And I am perfectly fine if there's some person who is much more comfortable behind the controls of a mass spec than in front of a reporter. But there's a lot of people who are fine in both capacities. So I wish there were more science ambassadors. I mean, unfortunately, we have our science societies doing a lot of that work for us. Things like the American Geophysical Union and the European Geophysical Union. They are doing a lot of the hard work of explaining to our lawmakers what science provides for people.
Yeah, no, the other day I was putting together a little presentation to give to a Rotary Club about the origin of life. I really, as part of this, I didn't have time because it was only 20 minutes, but I really wanted to tell them about the moon forming impact, which is such a great story, right? How you get the moon because you know, 4.5 billion years ago, you have a Mars-sized planetesimal or, protoplanet or planet, whatever you want to call it, that bashes into the Earth. And, within about 35 hours, you've got the moon formed and in its orbit because enough molten material got ejected into space. Earth is now as big as it is now. I mean, and there's like videos that people have put together of the most accurate simulations that they've come up with based on all the data that you have, like you know where the moon is now and how big it is and what its orbit is like, and uh, some information about the chemical and isotopic composition of the moon and the Earth, and so you can put this together and actually kind of figure out and keep figuring out. Every year you get a little bit better at coming up with better simulations as the computers get bigger and you get more data from more geochemical data that we can say 4.5 billion years ago, this planet came in, hit the Earth, and now we have the moon. And people don't know this.
It's shocking because we look up at that thing, many times in our lives, right? I was just outside looking at it. It's nearly full now here. I was here last night actually, and yeah, that Thea, that impactor, also gave us our seasons, right? That's why we have summer and winter because it knocked us silly, right? Knocked our orbit wacky, and so we have seasons. Why we have ice ages, right? There's all kinds of reasons why that's so amazingly fascinating. We have the biggest moon to planet ratio of any planet in the solar system, right? We have our own. It's I love that you brought that out because the moon is us, right? We erped it out along with this, and incorporated something else, and like you said, within a day and a half, boom, we got it. There's a solid ball that's been with us. Getting farther and farther away too over the billions of years as it's slowly spinning out its orbit. And but nevertheless, yeah, fascinating.
And yet somehow we're not managing to leak this information out to the general public. I mean, you can find the videos on YouTube, and people make websites when they've got federal grants or whatever. They make a website for the project that they're working on. But this isn't getting out to people. We are so when you can't even take a story as amazing and fascinating and explosive as the giant
Yeah,
moon forming impact, and you can't get that into the public consciousness. I mean, how are we failing at this? And then how could you ever expect to be like, well, and this is why it's really important that we measure, like, these heavy metals or whatever in fuel and air and lead and particles and
yeah,
wow. So
it's
I mean,
shocking. Yeah,
on some
because that's a good
level,
example of what's the most obvious thing that people live with, grow up living with their entire life. Well, our planet, stars, and the moon. The moon is just there. And so, how do you get curiosity in how subatomic particles work, or how dark matter occupies so much mass in how do you get that kind of interest, or that lead is, an immutable element, but it also has, human, causes human health harm. How do you get that across when people aren't even curious about the moon?
yeah, I know. And I think when you look at the level of science education yeah, starting in elementary school and middle schools and high schools, it's just inadequate. And why? Why aren't we doing a better job? Because that's why aren't we making people curious about these things? Because the world and the universe around us is just so interesting, and science is how you figure out how it works.
Yeah. I think we also, I think part of that is, on scientists, the thing you're informed about science when you're going through normal elementary and high school is that science is hard and only smart people can do it. Well, it doesn't have to be hard, and not only smart, everyone can touch on science. through the lives. And, and this idea, like what you just described, how is that hard to conceive of the fact that, well, early on, a big thing hit, erped out the moon, and there we have it. That, yeah, maybe to understand the physics is hard, but to understand just the basic, just wow, that's not hard. And so it's an area that I think we've done a very poor job historically in communicating that excitement. And instead, we've kind of put our boundary around science, like, oh, I'm a scientist and it's really hard, and you got to have all these degrees and these expensive instruments. But that's turned out to be to our own detriment, I think.
Yeah, something we have to work on. Thank you so much for your time. This has been a really informative discussion. And I will. So, are you suing the U.S. government to get your grant back?
No, State Department has a different, unfortunately, federal grants like through NSF, yeah, you
Hmm.
can sue, but the State Department, the only thing I could sue is for the unspent portion that was committed as unspent portion, but nothing had been contractually committed yet. So no, that's and so for example, if I submitted an NSF, I have 5 pending right now. I don't know if anyone's going to get funded, but if any of those are rejected because of the DEI or whatever, I can't sue that. It's only something that's a
Right.
normal termination.
Okay. Well, I was gonna say good luck, but I'll say good luck for the 5 pending
Okay.
grants. Because oh gosh, that 5 grant proposals, that is a lot of work. So,
It is.
and
I have a good team around me and stuff, so it's not like I'm sitting there writing, 15 pages of single space things 5 times. Yeah, but nevertheless, yeah, it is a fair amount of work.
so okay.
Yeah,
Well, as
great.
my
Thank
dad
you.
likes to say, keep up the good work, and
All right. Thank you.
yeah. And that's a wrap. Thanks for listening. Be sure to check out Gabe's book and stay Solarpunk. Thank you for listening to Solarpunk Presents, a podcast hosted and produced by Ariel Kroon and Christina De La Rocha.
The audio for this episode was recorded in part on the traditional territory of the neutral Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples.
And in Germany. The opening and closing music for this podcast is Water Cooler Gang by Monkey Warhol, available for use under the Creative Commons Attribution 4.0 International License.
Don't forget to support us on Patreon at patreon.com/solarpunkpresents.
Every little bit helps us keep bringing you discussions and interviews.
Until the next episode, keep dreaming.
And stay Solarpunk.